Estamos aqui hoje para conversar com a Whitney Johnson, sócia e diretora para a América do Norte da consultoria Potential Project. Ela vai falar no nosso webinar Construa uma equipe nota 10 e lidere a curva de aprendizagem. O segredo para ter uma equipe engajada e produtiva, qual é? É ter um plano para desenvolver todos os funcionários, não importa onde eles estejam, em suas próprias curvas de aprendizado. Maior moral e maior desempenho acontecem através da aprendizagem. Em mais de 20 anos trabalhando nessa área, Whitney constatou que os funcionários precisam de um aprendizado contínuo e novos desafios para se manterem motivados. Os melhores chefes sabem disso e sabem como fazer isso, projetando cuidadosamente o trabalho das pessoas em torno das habilidades que elas têm hoje, bem como daquelas que elas vão precisar desenvolver. É assim que organizações inteiras se mantêm competitivas em um ambiente de negócio imprevisível e que muda rapidamente, esse nosso mundo VUCA. Nesse nosso webinar, Whitney explica como se tornar um desses chefes e como construir uma equipe nota 10. Hello, Whitney. Thank you for accepting our invitation to join our HBR Week.
Good afternoon, Anna, and I am delighted to be here. And hello to everyone. It's so nice to meet all of you. I love Brazil. Formerly, when I worked on Wall Street, I was an analyst covering telecom and media stocks in Latin America. And so I've had an opportunity to spend some time, not only in Sao Paulo and Rio, but also in Brasilia. And our son, who's now 22 years old, spent 2 years in Brazil in Campinas. So you all hold a very special place in my heart. And I'm just really delighted to be able to be with you today. I want to start off, and in just a moment, I'm going to actually go to some slides for us to look at. So I'm going to talk to you. We'll look at these slides and have you follow along as I talk. I want you to think about this idea or this premise that high growth organizations need high growth individuals. If your organization is going to continue to grow in the way that you want it to grow, or to grow even faster, it's the people who work for you that are going to take you there. So the question is how do you calibrate the people who work for you for growth, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and then maintain that growth? Well, that's what we're going to talk about over the next couple of minutes, is not only how we help the people who we work with to keep up, but also how do we help them thrive in a high growth environment. We're going to do that by introducing 2 frameworks. The first is our proprietary framework of personal disruption. It's a 7-point framework, a mechanism that allows you to accelerate your personal growth. And once we've introduced that framework, then we'll move to and spend most of our time on the S-curve of learning framework that employs or applies this mechanism of personal disruption to help you build a high-performing team, a high-performing organization, so that you have those high-growth individuals that you need to develop or build that high-growth organization. So I want to start off by asking you the question, how does a person who majored in music in college, like me, I played the piano, from the United States, end up speaking to a group of senior executives like you in Brazil? The answer is, if you were whispering in my ear, would be you disrupt yourself. When I graduated from college, at Brigham Young University, my husband and I moved to New York so he could pursue his PhD at Columbia. And I was absolutely terrified. I suspect many of you have been to New York, and I was just terrified driving across that George Washington Bridge into Manhattan. I can still feel the terror that I felt. And for the first week, I wouldn't go anywhere by myself. But we needed to eat, and so I eventually had to leave our 19th floor apartment and get a job. Because I had majored in music, because I knew absolutely no one in New York, because I had absolutely no confidence, and at the risk of stating the obvious, I'm a woman, I started as a secretary. Across from my desk, there was this bullpen of young male stockbrokers, all aspiring masters of the universe. This was the era of Liar's Poker and Bonfire, the Vanities, and Working Girl. So the pressure for people to open accounts was very, very intense. And so they'd say things like, throw down your pom-poms and get in the game. At first, I was actually a little bit offended because I was a cheerleader in high school. But as I listened to this over and over again and realizing that I was going to have to work at least 5 years, and why would I make X when 10X is a possibility, it was time for me to throw down my pom-poms. I wouldn't have known to call it this then, but that was really the beginning of me disrupting myself. I started taking business courses at night, accounting, finance, economics. I then had a boss who believed in me, which allowed me to move from secretary to investment banker, which if you've been in financial services, you know rarely happens. I then moved from banking to equity research, had 2 children, which is a very big disruption. Eventually left Wall Street to co-found an investment firm with Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And now several disruptions later, I've become an author, a researcher, and I've codified this framework of personal disruption that I get to teach to people like you and other people around the world. But that was the beginning. And that is really my message to you today, to disrupt yourself over and over and over again. Now, what do I mean when I say disrupt yourself, or more specifically, disruptive innovation? It's a term that we hear a lot. So what do I mean when I say it? Well, at its simplest, it's this silly little thing that takes over the world, like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. More recently, we've seen disruption in the form of Toyota disrupting General Motors, Netflix disrupting Blockbuster, and now cable TV. Well, disruptive innovation, it follows a framework. The disruptor secures this place, this foothold at the low end of the market. And think about Netflix in the 90s. Initially, its products are inferior, its position is weak. Blockbuster at this point in time could have completely crushed them like a cucaracha, but they didn't, because market leaders rarely bother. It's just this silly little door-to-door DVD rental service. Let's go after bigger and higher margins and better. The bad news, or the good, depending on your point of view, is that once a disruptor gains a foothold, it too is motivated by bigger, better, and so it goes. And why are they so motivated? Well, because the theory of disruption states that the odds of your success are 6 times higher. 6 times higher. The odds of success are 6 times higher, and the revenue opportunity 20 times greater when you pursue a disruptive course. So that's disruptive innovation. Personal disruption, which is what we're going to focus on today, is how you take all of these ideas and make them meaningful to you. So you start at the bottom of a ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder, like the children's game Chutes and Ladders. Lady Gaga, she's a master of personal disruption. Think about it. She starts at the bottom of a ladder, and then in 2008, she goes straight to the top of the charts. And then what does she do for an encore? She jumps to the bottom of a new ladder. And this ladder, it's something that really people could not have liked. So what does she do? She collaborates with Tony Bennett on a jazz album. She then does a Sound of Music tribute at the Oscars. And then she produces a country album. But these jumps, they paid off. Her performance at the Super Bowl in 2017 had the largest music audience ever. Now, the big difference with personal disruption between disruptive innovation is that your Toyota and your General Motors, your Netflix and your Blockbuster, you are the silly little thing, and you take over the world because you are disrupting you. And why are you so motivated to disrupt yourself? Dopamine. Whenever you learn something, your brain gets this squirt of dopamine, that chemical in your brain that makes you happy. And so you disrupt yourself over and over again. So what I want you to think about for just a minute is think about your life. You've already actually disrupted yourself a lot. Possibly beginning in high school when you were 14 years old, you started at the bottom of the ladder and then you climbed to the top, and then you graduated and you jumped to the bottom of the ladder in college, and then you climbed to the top and then you jumped to the bottom in your first job. So you've disrupted yourself a lot. Now, just to reinforce, before we really move on from this basic idea of personal disruption, to reinforce how powerful it is, I want you to take a look at this broken asphalt. And I want you to think about broken asphalt when you drive today. Asphalt can withstand thousands of pounds of pressure. So why did it break? Well, at one point, there was this tiny crack and it was almost invisible. But then it rained and it possibly snowed, and the water then froze and expanded, and it broke because asphalt cannot handle internal pressure. Well, you're like asphalt. When change comes, you feel like you're under siege, and so you do more of what you've been doing, hoping that you're going to be able to resist what's pounding against you. But if you have the courage to do more of what you have not been doing, this is where our inability to handle internal pressure can actually work in your favor. Just a few small changes, like drops of water, permeate, expand, breaking your hold on the past just enough to create space for something new and better. Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, clearly knew about external pressure, but he also knew about internal pressure because he wrote the book Anna Karenina. Here's what he had to say. Revolutions are an attempt to shatter the power of evil by violence. We think that by hammering upon the mass, we can break it into fragments, but this makes it more dense and impermeable. Disruptive movement must come from within. I'm going to say that one more time because I really want you to think about this. Disruptive movement must come from within. So the fundamental unit of disruption, the fundamental unit of change in your organization, it's the individual. If you disrupt yourself, others will do the same. If you disrupt yourself, you become a high growth individual. And if you become a high growth individual, you will have a high growth organization. So that's a very quick overview. This is the framework of personal disruption. There is not time for us to go through all of this today. If you want to do more work, you can listen to our podcast, the Disrupt Yourself podcast. You can listen to the book, but I wanted to give you this very quick overview of this framework of personal disruption, understanding that this is fundamental to building a high performing team. So now what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears. And actually, I'm not going to go there quite yet. We're going to shift gears. So you've got this understanding of this mechanism, understanding that if you want to be an agent of disruption, you first become its subject. If you want to keep up as an organization, you learn how to disrupt yourself. And so now we're going to take this mechanism, learn about the S-curve of learning framework, and talk about how you build a high-performing team. And to introduce that, I want to tell you two stories. So story number one. Imagine for just a minute that you've gotten a call from a headhunter. So someone who's trying to recruit you for a job. And they tell you about this company and try to say, okay, well, this company, they invented their product 60 years ago. At the time, it was really important, a really exciting invention. It kept rockets, it kept missiles from rusting. But since then, not much has changed. So that's why I have a picture of a headhunter of about 60 years ago. Think to yourself, you get this call, you love your job, you get this call, but you're like, are you interested? The answer is no, right? You're not interested in this job. It's this boring, staid company. Why would you possibly be interested? But what if the headhunter now gives you more information? The headhunter tells you people they absolutely love to work at this company. And the headhunter tells you that over the last 20 years, the last 2 decades, their market capitalization in US dollars has increased from $250 million to $2 billion, an 8 times increase, significantly outperforming the S&P 500. It's a lot more interesting now, isn't it? you're like, okay, I love my job, but I'm still going to have this conversation because this company sounds really interesting. Well, the mystery company, it's WD-40. It's this product that keeps things from squeaking, and people love to work there. Okay, story number 2. So I am working on Wall Street. I've been doing this for about 8 years. I'm an equity analyst, and as I said earlier, I'm covering stocks in places like Brazil and all of Latin America. But I've gotten good at what I'm doing. I'm an award-winning equity analyst. I'm working at Merrill Lynch. I go into my boss and I say, you know, I'd really like to try something new. And my boss says to me, well, actually, we like you right where you are. Like, we don't want you to move. We want you to stay right here. Well, this is 2004, and I've now read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, and I've had this kernel of an idea that this theory, it's not just about products, it's also about people. And that for me and my career to move forward, I'm going to have to take a step back, which is what you do when you disrupt yourself. So within a year, I actually quit my job and eventually went on to co-found the Disruptive Innovation Fund with Christensen. So here I am, I'm working on Wall Street, one of the most exciting places in the world to work, and I leave. In my experience, it's not uncommon. The experience that my boss was having, it's not uncommon, because for all of you who are listening today, I know that you want to be a great boss. I know you do. I know that you want to develop the people that work for you. But when you have things that you have to get done, you have deadlines, you have budgets, there's this feeling that you need people right where they are doing what they've always done. And so now you've got a revolving door. It doesn't stop. You're maybe even the one pushing it. It's costing you time. It's costing you money. And what do you have? You have the innovator's dilemma. Whether you innovate or not, there's risk, but with people. So how do you stop this dilemma? How do you stop the revolving door? How is it possible that if you develop your people, you're going to get more done? How is it possible that if you will disrupt yourself, you can lower your disruption score? Think about that. If you disrupt yourself, can you lower your disruption score? How do you solve this dilemma? Well, WD-40, that company that isn't flashy, that company that made that product 60 years ago, that company that stops things from squeaking, well, they have the answer. They allow, they encourage, they require their people to, they require you to disrupt yourself. When we researched the company, and interviewed the CEO, Gary Ridge, we found out that 3 of their senior people started as a receptionist, and 1 is now the company brand manager. When we administered our disruption diagnostic, we learned that 60% of their people believe that they can achieve all of their career goals without ever leaving WD-40. This is a company that develops their people through repeated personal disruptions. They learn, they leap, and then they repeat. Or they leap, they learn, and then they leap and repeat. Learn, leap, repeat. Now, because the squeaky wheel of an idea gets the grease, I'm going to tell you another story. I want you to imagine for just a moment that you have sailed 200,000 miles, the distance from the Earth to the moon, in a year when there is no GPS. I mean, what would that have been like? What would it have been like to be the very first person from Europe to land in Sydney, Australia, to visit the Hawaiian Islands, to be one of the most famous explorers and map makers in history? Now, we now know that there were consequences of these explorations. There always are with disruption. But what would it have been like to map a third of the globe and your maps are still in use 200 years later? Question is, though, would any of this have happened? Would it have happened had it not been for a person who was willing to help another person learn? Another person learn, leap, and repeat. There was a young boy growing up in England, early 1700s. His family is poor. They're absolutely impoverished. But one of the local lords, local leaders of the town, sees he's gifted, so he pays for his school. When this young boy has the sea call to him, a ship owner takes him on as an apprentice. And then after rising up in the merchant navy, he disrupts himself to join the Royal Navy. Without these people who were willing to invest, willing to challenge, willing to develop, Captain James Cook may have wasted away unaccomplished, unknown. Instead, he wrote in his journal, "I have sailed farther than any other man before me." Star Trek fans, maybe there are a few Trekkies today listening, will know that Captain James T. Kirk is modeled after Cook. He wants to boldly go where no man has gone before. This is what people want on the job. This is what the people who work for you want. This is what we all want. We want to boldly go where we haven't gone. And yet, we like a little bit of predictability. If you could peek into a crystal ball, you probably would. And if we could take off in that starship full of our dreams, well, we might. So now we've got this, what do I do with this? Because we know that on one hand, it is change, it's innovation, it's learning that's going to make you a person people want to work for. It's going to make your organization an organization of fast and rapid high growth, but it also challenges you. It requires you to iterate, to disrupt the current version of you. Well, this is where the S curve comes in. It was popularized by E.M. Rogers in 1962, and it looks a lot like a wave. We used it at our Disruptive Innovation Fund to help us gauge how quickly an innovation would be adopted. At the base of the S, growth is slow until a tipping point is reached, or the knee of the curve, and you enter hypergrowth, and at saturation, that growth tapers off. As we were applying this S curve for investing, I had this insight, this aha, that it could also help us understand people. Whenever you start something new, you're at the base of the S, the bottom of the wave. Growth will be slow. It can feel like a slog. You can feel discouraged. But as you put in the effort, you're going to accelerate into competence and confidence and engagement. And this is the sweet spot where all your neurons are firing. And then as you approach mastery, things will be easy. But because you're no longer learning, you're no longer getting that dopamine, you can start to get bored. So something I want you to think about for just a moment is, in your current role, where are you on the learning curve? And are you happy there? Are you at the low end of the curve where you're just figuring things out and there's this jumble of pieces, you don't know how they fit together? Or are you in the sweet spot where you know enough but not too much and you feel like this is exactly where I should be right now? Or are you at the high end where you do know exactly what you're doing, but you're finding that you're just a little bit bored? So again, think about that. In your current role, where are you on the learning curve, and are you happy there? Now, just a minute ago, I said that the learning curve looks a lot like a wave. So let's look at an actual wave and see how it happens. Ocean waves are caused by the wind moving across the water. It's the friction of the air molecules against the water molecules that causes the energy to be transferred from the wind to water, and this causes the wave to form. But here's what's interesting. The water doesn't actually travel with the wave. Think about if you've ever been to a football game, right? You go to a football game and you all do the wave. What's happening? It's not the water that's traveling. The water's just moving up and down. It's the energy that travels. Well, it's the same with you. It's the same with every individual. Whenever you start something new, you're at the bottom of a wave, but then with the friction of a challenge, that energy builds until it peaks or crests and eventually crashes. So you've got the same water, you've got the same individual, but you have different levels of energy. Just as the ocean is made up of many waves, your team, your organization is a collection of learning curves. And what we found in our research is that you build a high-performing team by optimizing those curves. At any given time, you want to have 70% of your people on the steep part of that curve. You want to have 15% of your people at the low end of the curve and 15% of your people at the high end of the curve. And in fact, if you're thinking yourself, are we about to be disrupted? Like, is our organization at risk? All you have to do is just take the pulse of your workforce. If you have too many people at the high end of that curve, that mastery where they're no longer getting that dopamine, you're at risk. So think about this for a minute. Draw out that S. Think about your team. Where are the people on your team on the learning curve? Do you have most of your people on that steep part, or do you have a lot at the high end or a lot at the low end? Think about that. And again, think about where you are. And you optimize, you build that high-performing team, that high-performing organization by having this kind of distribution. So you allow the people to disrupt themselves, they get to the top of the curve, then they jump, and then you build that high-performing team by optimizing where people are on the learning curve. Now, once you have a clear picture of where your flock or bevy of S curves is, it's time to practice personal disruption to create that cadence, to load balance those curves, and to create that cadence of learn, leap, and repeat. All right, let's do a quick recap before we go into a little bit more detail. So everyone in your organization is on a learning curve, including you. Your organization, your team is a collection of those learning curves. You build a high-performing team by optimizing those curves. 70% in the sweet spot, 15% at the low end, and 15% at the high end. Every organization needs a culture in order to grow. Like a vine, it needs something to attach to. This S curve of learning framework enables all your individuals to take responsibility for their own learning, to understand that they need to disrupt themselves. But it also provides you as a leader a framework and a language to operate in. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper, and we'll do this quickly, but let's just go a little bit deeper. The question you're probably asking yourself is, all right, this is interesting. I got it. Personal framework of personal disruption. I need to disrupt myself. I understand this S curve of learning framework. How do I move along this curve? But how do I actually execute the strategy? How do I manage people at different points along the curve? And more specifically, how do I manage the 15% of your people, or my people, at the low end of the curve? Well, here are 3 suggestions. Number 1, you actually start by hiring people at the low end of the curve. Be willing to have people who are at the bottom of the curve. What do? You hire for potential, people who are inexperienced at the low end of the curve, not for proficiency. And to see what I mean, or what that can look like, I want you to come with me to a place called Butte, Montana. It's in the United States. And in the mid-1800s, miners went to Butte who were panning. They wanted gold and silver, and they were mining for gold and silver, but it completely disappointed. There wasn't enough gold, so they sold off all their claims. And the next wave of miners, they discovered something called copper. Now, at the time, copper was not valuable. It wasn't valuable, so they found it not interesting. But as technology advanced and electrical wiring became a thing, copper became extremely valuable. And now those patient miners are known as copper kings. So I frequently think of Butte, Montana when people say, I can't find anybody to hire. Well, what they're saying is, I want people at the top of the curve. I want the gold standard. But what about copper? There are compelling reasons to go for copper, to hire for potential, not for proficiency. When you do that, you are effectively, going back to the stock market, you're effectively buying low and selling high. All right, so once you've hired at the low end of the curve, so that's number 1, hire at the low end of the curve. Once you've done that, hired at the low end of the curve, suggestion number 2 is to have a plan. Whenever we hire someone, we subconsciously believe that this person is going to stay with us forever, our one true employee. But they can't, they shouldn't, and they won't. So have a plan for their 6 months at the low end of the curve, They're 3 to 4 years in the sweet spot, and they're 6 months at the high end of the curve before you, yes, you help them jump to a new curve. Now, suggestion number 3. Oh, remember, time plus competence equals boredom. All right, suggestion number 3 is value their inexperience. At the low end of the curve, they're going to grow. That's a reminder, value their experience. Every time you hear a phone from now on, I want you to think, value their inexperience, because they're going to be slow. And what that means is that they're also capable because they're slow. They're looking at everything, trying to understand everything. They're capable. They're not blind from all this familiarity of asking questions like, why do you do it like this? And sometimes those questions can feel kind of annoying, like just get to work, go do your work. But sometimes they can also feel kind of threatening because they're saying, why do you do it like this? But those are the kinds of questions that, if you'll be open to them, can open the door to innovation. All right, so number 1, you want to hire people at the low end of the curve. Number 2, have a plan for your people at the low end of the curve. And number 3, value their inexperience. And as that momentum of the S curve starts to build and they move into the sweet spot, now what? What do you do with the 70% of your people on the steep part of the curve? Unlike at the low end of the curve, where a lot of time passed and very little happened, now in a little time, a lot happened. So it's easy to say, they're doing great, I'll leave them be. But that's precisely what they don't. Think about it. Jaws. I'm going to tell you 3 reasons why they need you to give them more constraints, not less. So Jaws, some of the most famous scenes in this film came about because the mechanical shark that Steven Spielberg wanted to use, it didn't work. So he's over budget, he's behind schedule, he finally decides to shoot the scenes from the shark's point of view. There was a post-mortem of 200 failed startups. They divided them into funded and unfunded startups. Well, the number 1 reason that the funded startups went out of business, they ran out of cash. Isn't that ironic? They had money and they ran out of cash. But it was only the number 10 reason for the companies that had to bootstrap, that had to build their business based on the cash that they had on hand. And in skateboarders, they're some of the quickest learners in the world because they receive incredibly fast and useful feedback. Every action, every move has an immediate consequence. So I ask you, skateboarders, Spielberg startups successful in spite of or because of their constraints? As your sweet spotters gain momentum, they need more challenges, more constraints, more friction. Remember the wave? It was the friction that caused the wave to form. How does a former fighter pilot instructor become a successful entrepreneur? Friction. Alana Golan, she trained fighter pilots in the military. And when she retired from the military, she went to work at Intel. She's an intern at the low end of the curve. But she's also been training fighter pilots, a lot of fighter pilots. So her boss, he creates some friction. He gives her a stretch assignment. Her stretch assignment is to find a startup or to find a solution for developing verification tools for software. She starts in academia, stalls a bit. It was a risk giving her this assignment. That's what a stretch assignment is. But then with some help leading her up that learning curve, she finds a startup in Sweden that could work. She tests it, analyzes it, builds a prototype, and Intel buys the software. They use it for decades. When your people are in this sweet spot, they need more constraints, more challenges, more friction, more stretch assignments. So that's the first thing that they need. The second thing that they need you to say thank you. They need you to appreciate them. They're not the problem child, so appreciate them. And I love this quote from Gretchen Rubin. She said that we think someone who criticizes us, so you're the boss, we think that someone who criticizes us is smarter than we are, more discerning. But enthusiasm is a form, therefore enthusiasm is a form of social courage. Giving positive reviews requires humility. What does that mean? It means that when you've got people working for you, you want to only criticize them because it makes you feel smart. But if you want to encourage them and help them move up that learning curve, you'll be willing to be humble enough to say thank you and job well done. So give them stretch assignments and say thank you. Remember, as I said a minute ago, they're not the problem child. Don't make them one by ignoring them, because you're going to have plenty of problem children at the top of the curve. Here's your challenge. After months, possibly years of developing them, they become your go-to person. Why would you push them to do something new? But this is the danger zone. Now, just a minute ago, I said to you, all right, so average length of a curve is 4 years, and then you need to jump to a new curve. But there are ways you can extend out the curve. And sometimes you're going to need to, because for whatever reason, you can't jump to a new curve. So here are 3 things you can do with people at the top of curve. Number 1, you can jump in place. What do I mean when I say that? Well, jumping in place means you can get a coach, for example. You can commit, excuse me, to study your industry, how to become a better leader. You jump in place on the curve you're on. The second thing you can do is you can become a master to the apprentice. The willingness to lead people up a learning curve, learning how to teach, how to develop, that's a whole new learning curve in and of itself. And then the third thing that you can do is you can give people stretch assignments. I remember not too long ago, I was speaking at SAP in India, and I had met a young man. He's an engineer, mid-level manager. He had inherited a team, and they were at the top of the curve. They did not want to jump to a new curve, and he couldn't make them jump, but he could make them stretch. So what did he do? They had to prepare to do this big speech, this big presentation. They wanted to prepare like they always prepared. Instead, he made them practice and practice and practice and practice some more. They complained a lot. But when the presentation went really well at the end of the year, they had their performance reviews. They said this was a highlight of their year. So stretch assignments, jump in place, master to the apprentice. To be clear though, just because you've been in a role for more than 4 years does not necessarily mean that you're at the top of the curve. If you're still engaged and you're lowering your disruption score, then you're in the sweet spot. But if you're disengaged and raising it, then that's when you're at the top of the curve and it's time to jump to a new curve. All other things being equal though, if you're at the top of the curve and you don't jump, our research says you've got 6 months, maybe a year before that plateau becomes a precipice. Mountain climbers, they will tell you that any altitude above 26,000 feet is the death zone. You are so high up, your brain and your body start to die. Your people at the top of a learning curve, it's not the danger zone, it's actually the death zone. If you leave them there too long, their brains and bodies will start to die. So don't let them die. Help them jump. Help them jump. Now, if we were talking to each other right now, what I would have you do, and you can do it if you wanted, you stand up and I want you to figuratively have that experience of jumping to a brand new learning curve, maybe even move to a new chair in the room. And why do you do that? Because you'll move to that new chair and you'll realize, oh, I'm at the bottom of a new learning curve. I was feeling really comfortable where I was, but now I'm not feeling quite so comfortable. And you start to ask questions that are important to ask because that's what you do at the low end of the curve. All right, got just a few more minutes before we wrap up. Bruce Lee, he was one of the greatest martial artists ever, but he was also a brilliant teacher. And so people would come to him and say, I want you to teach me. So he'd take them out and he'd test them to see what they knew. And then he'd bring them back inside, sit them down and say, okay, I want you to look at this glass of Coke. Look at this glass of Coke. This is what you know, and this is what you think is the truth. Then he'd point them to a glass of water and say, this is what I know, glass of water, this is the truth, and this is what you want, but I can't give it to you because there's too much of your knowledge. There's too much of your knowledge. However, if you're willing to let go of some of your knowledge to make room for mine, then we can work together. But if you hold on to this, I can't give you this. My question to you as you're thinking through these ideas of building this high-performing team, are you prepared to empty your cup? Now, if you are, here are some things you need to know. It's not going to be easy. Here's why. There was a study done, Boris Groysberg, you're probably familiar with Boris because he's a professor at Harvard Business School, study done of small and medium-sized businesses and asked them to rate themselves on 40 different HR practices. Rated themselves, did the study, 2018, 450 companies. The one with the third lowest score was developing high potentials. we're not good at developing people that we think are high potentials. And the practice with the lowest score was job rotations. Job rotations. Why is it so hard for people to jump to new learning curves? And why is it so hard to adopt the S-curve strategy? Well, let's think through it. Let's think through the objections. Because I know you're thinking, I love this idea. Well, I hope you're thinking, I love this idea, but you've got lots of objections. So let's think through what they are. Number one is, why would I move a star performer to a new role? I like them right where they are. They're doing me a lot of good right where they are. Another objection people might have is, why would I hire for potential versus experience? I can afford the gold standard. The gold standard makes me look good. It means I don't have to train. Why would I take copper when I can get gold? And third is, how is it possible that an underperformer in one role, maybe it's because they were at the top of the curve and getting bored, could be a standout in another? So these are some of the objections. There are more. Now, here's what I want you to think about. If you're going to overcome these objections, here's how you're going to do it. Here's the trick. You have to make it scarier for people not to change. We are more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. This is loss aversion theory, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky. We are more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. So we have to make it scarier not to change. So how do you do that? Well, you're going to lose your high performers. If you don't change, if you try to leave them right where they are, they're going to leave you right where you are. Even if they do stay, because they're not learning, because they're not getting dopamine, they won't be engaged. And if they're not engaged, they won't innovate. They may not even work. And if they don't innovate, you will lose to faster adapting competitors. Now that you've hit yourself over the head with a stick of everything you're going to lose, I want you to try this quick carrot of a story of what you'll gain. This is my very last story. I want you to imagine that you are a vice president. You are one of 25 at a company of 6,000 people. You have a business line of $1 billion and about 1,000 people reporting to you total. That's what the top of the curve looked like for Dan Shapiro at LinkedIn. So he graduates from college in math and statistics. He goes to business school. He then works for Bain in consulting. And then in 2008, he lands at LinkedIn in operations. Starts at the bottom or probably the middle of the curve. By 2010, he's at the top of the curve, so he jumps to the bottom of a new curve in sales. By 2013, he's now again at the top of another curve. He has grown revenue from $10 million to $1 billion. So yes, it's a rocket ship. He had 8 reports, now 1,000. So he goes to the CEO and says, okay, like this is going to be a victory lap. The CEO is going to be saying, good job. So during that meeting, he shares with the CEO, someday I'd like to be a tech CEO myself. What does the CEO say to him? Not what he expected. He says, if that's your dream, you're in the wrong job. Tech CEOs build product. You're in sales. You cannot get to where you want to go from here. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if your boss said that to you? You worked so hard, you think he's going to pat you on the back, and instead they're like, no, can't do it. So completely deflated, he goes back, and most of you probably would have said, I'm going to get a new job, but Dan doesn't. He goes back, thinks about it for about 2 months, comes back to his boss and says, okay, let's do it. Let's build great product. What? You're going to go from leading a team of 1,000 people and $1 billion P&L to an individual contributor, 4 engineers, and no guarantees based on the data. And LinkedIn has a ton of data, as you all know. People don't move from sales to product, but Dan did. He did. And you know what? He says there were parts he was terrible at because he's at the low end of the curve. He's inexperienced, but there were parts he was amazing at. Well, 6 years later, he just went up that product curve and now has jumped to the bottom of a new curve. He's circled back to sales and is responsible for sales, all $5 billion of it. Isn't that impressive? I'm amazed at that story, but you know what amazes me even more is that they actually let him do it because there was a risk. There was a risk in Dan jumping. There was a risk for his family. There was a risk for his boss. There was a risk for this company, but this step back, that willingness to become a silly little thing turned out to be a slingshot for Dan and for his company. We're learning machines. You're a learning machine. You want to not know how to do something, to figure out how to do it, to master it, and start all over again. You want to learn, leap, and repeat. All right, final thought. It's the middle of the afternoon. You're probably getting hungry. Well, I want you to take a look at this loaf of bread. It's freshly baked, straight out of the oven. The smell is just going throughout your entire house, your entire apartment. It's just calling you to the kitchen. You put your hand on the bread, it's still warm. You pick up a knife, you slice it, you slather it with butter and your favorite homemade jam. Mine happens to be strawberry. Yum, 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 yum. Well, we bake bread and then we break bread. And when you break bread, it releases oxytocin. It's a beautiful experience as we come together. Bread needs sugar, yeast, water in order to rise. If it doesn't rise long enough, you get this flat thing that pioneers called hardtack. But if it rises too long, it collapses. Bread needs attention, but not too much. That's part of the magic, is it does a lot of the work on its own. Well, just as it's possible to bake a perfect loaf of bread, to be a baker, it's possible for you to build an ideal team, to be a maker. You start with the raw ingredients, hiring for potential. In order for your people to rise, you challenge them, you need them, appreciate them. Once they've risen, before they collapse, you give them something new to do. Whether you are leading a team of 10 or 10,000, you are in a position to help people rise. But leading people up the learning curve, it's always the kind of thing that's easier to do tomorrow. Today isn't the day to let people jump to new curves. Today, I have deadlines. Today, I have budgets. Today, I am busy. But for the best bosses, today is the day. Because building an A-team, it's actually not just about personal disruption. It's about you. It's about you as a leader who has the power to help people go where they haven't gone, to live their best lives. A leader who's a lighthouse, providing safety and support for each and every S-curve wave, a harbor for their ship of dreams. The best bosses, they don't build just one A-team. You don't build just one A-team. You build vast networks of A-teams across oceans, across companies, across careers, across lives. So I want to leave you with this final question. Do you want to be a boss that people want to work for? Are you willing to do the disrupting of yourself to build an A-team? Are you willing? And if you are, then will you? Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to turn it back to Anna to wrap us up. It's been an absolute pleasure having the opportunity to share these ideas with you. And if you do have any questions, you can obviously email me at wj@whitneyjohnson.com, and I would be happy, or actually you can send them to Anna, but you can also email me as well, either one, whichever works for you. But again, thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Whitney, for sharing your ideas and your research with us. I'm sure our audience is going to leave in here with a lot of thinking and reflection to do in the next few days or maybe in the next few months. And I really hope that you are going to be with us next year. So thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you.